Let me tell you now a little bit about the U.S. history because I was born in the U.S. and I gave birth in 1970 during one childbirth trend and in 1982 during a second childbirth trend. And also from the 70s until I immigrated to New Zealand in 95, I was involved in the global childbirth conversation, always from the viewpoint of how do consumers give birth within multiple maternity systems. In the 60s, really until the late 1970s, the first ever childbirth preparation classes were taught, and they were the Lamaze and Bradley method. Grantley Dick Reed was vaguely known, but not really. Those classes were entirely skills-based because women in the United States didn't have choices. We followed our doctor's orders. We didn't have any midwives either, so we all birthed in the hospital. Sure, some of us birthed at home, but that wasn't part of the state regulations that were available to women. Lamaze, however, was taught in probably every hospital in the United States, even in the small hospitals. There was an extremely high societal expectation that if you were pregnant, you attended a childbirth preparation class. And Lamaze and Bradley was taught mostly in people's homes, had the same three goals as Grantley Dick Reed. They were concerned about the medicalization of all births, so they focused on low-risk women, assuming that low-risk women would have a low-risk birth and have a pain-free labor, and to do that without medical care. The Bradley method was sort of more upmarket, and Bradley was called husband coach childbirth. Fathers were permitted into births, not cesareans, years before they were permitted into births in New Zealand. And so we all went to classes. We expected our husbands to come in and help us. We also were all birthing in the hospital. When I gave birth in 1970, I was shaved. I had an enema. I had to lie in bed. I couldn't eat and drink. I was given episiotomy. My daughter went into a nursery. By 1982, when I gave birth, things had changed. When I gave birth in 1982, it was an interesting period of time in the United States. The natural childbirth movement there was just beginning to form because you have 50 states with 50 different rules and regulations around childbirth. It wasn't easy to have a national movement. Ina May Gaskin's book, Spiritual Midwifery, had been published in 1976. The childbirth classes were quickly shifting to choices and away from skills because not a sufficient number of women in the U.S. or in New Zealand had achieved natural births using Lamaze or Bradley method. So when I gave birth in 1982, birth plans were just beginning to be used by a tiny percent of women. But hospital policies had shifted dramatically. We could get up and move around, we could eat, we could have multiple people in the room with us. And that all occurred not because of pressure by a natural birth movement, but because multiple millions of women and men had used skills effectively to cope, to work through, to manage, deal with, to handle, to stay on top of, and feel in control during birth. And those multiple millions of women had done it with all the assessments, monitoring procedures. It's not difficult to use skills, even if you have a tube coming out of every single one of your holes. And it makes a huge difference to yourself as a birthing woman, the person who's helping you cope and manage, and to those who are in attendance at your birth. I went into labor 8 weeks prematurely. I had 10 years of experience with birthing better skills and being so many birthing better births. I knew that I would have assessments, monitoring procedures that the hospital felt were necessary to safeguard the health and well-being of an 8-week premature baby. I used my skills, and they were very comfortable in letting me birth my son by myself. That's how much it had changed from 1970 to 1982. It's not a change in home births. It was not a change in having more midwives. It was not a change in having a partnership. It was not a change in reducing the assessments, monitoring, and procedures. It was a change because my generation of women from the 60s to the late 70s and their partners or others, we used skills. And that had such a positive impact on maternity care in the United States. Sadly, today, there are very few skilled women and men. So from the 60s to the late 70s in the United States, multiple millions of families became skilled. Labor and delivery nurses, since there were no midwives and obstetricians, saw women cope and saw fathers really being able to help. In other words, we reduced the suffering that is so prevalent in childbirth throughout time. We all use the skills with and around all of the assessments, monitoring procedures, because the word interventions wasn't being used yet. Back in 1970, when I gave birth, the cesarean rate was 4.5%. It was still major abdominal surgery. Women were knocked out. It was done only to save a woman's life. So basically, 95% of us labored, whether we labored for hours, whether we labored for days, whether we had risks or not, whether we coped, whether we suffered, whether we had a good outcome or a tragedy. All of those things in 1970 were considered normal and natural and accepted. Birthing better skills and the concept started to develop in 1972 because the families I worked with found that the Lamaze and the Bradley skills did not adjust well, and they were focused on low-risk women. I worked with very religious, high-risk women with no medical background. I don't have any. By intent, I chose not to. I worked with consumers. And so our goal for 10 years was to make the coping skills more adjustable, more adaptable, and more sustainable, so we worked together better. And we achieved that. Birthing Better Skills achieved that. So that's a short history of the United States.